Everyone, so glad to have you with us. It's a beautiful morning. It's Friday, imagine that. And we're having our Friday forum. So I'm so glad you're able to be here. My name is Cyndy McDonald, and I am a counselor. I am an entrepreneur. I'm a business coach, and I'm a producer. And I'm also an OMA, which I really is probably one of the biggest delights of my life right now. I love having conversations with interesting people around the world, bringing topics that are important to you. And so as you're joining us today, go ahead and put in your name and your location and let us know what you're doing for this weekend, if you have something fun and exciting planned. I'm leaving for Costa Rica tomorrow, so I'm definitely looking forward to that, and able to do some different things. So we're glad to have you here today. And I was telling Dr. Seemiller, Corey, that we have an audience from all over the world. So please let us know if you're in another country and also the states that you're in. So glad to have you. I'm glad to have Dr. Corey Seemiller with me today. She is a researcher. She and I have been corresponding and done a few conversations over the years. She's a professor in the Department of Leadership Studies and Education and Organizations at Wright State University. She's the author of the Student Leadership Competencies Guidebook, which I would recommend you look into because it's a prominent source for developing youth and college student leadership programs. So those are things that our students could really benefit from. It's a prominent, Dr. Seemiller is also a co-author of several articles, as well as 4 books on Generation Z. And I remember when the very first book came out, I was just so fascinated that there was a generational book, Generation Z Goes to College. And I've been following the work you've done, Dr. Seemiller, ever since. She also has Generation Z, A Century in the Making. I mentioned Generation Z Goes to College, Generation Z Leads, and Generation Z Learns, because all of us that work with teenagers at the moment do realize that they do things differently than our generation or their parents' generation or whichever other generations are working with them. She's also co-authored the Gen Z Voices on Voting Research report and the Campus Tomorrow report. What we're going to talk a little bit about today is a global Gen Z study. And this is one that you did with 91 research collaborators. I can imagine that was like herding cats. And they're from around the globe to better understand Generation Z in this post-COVID world. There were participants from 81 countries in the study, and it's going to be published in January. So we'll give you links and information about that, Gen Z around the world, and it's being published with Emerald Publishing. And so we're very excited to have that. And it's okay, so you're also doing a study that's published with Emerald, and the book is published with Sage Publishing. Is that how it works?
I actually have 2 books. Yes, one with Sage Publishing coming out in 2025 called Guide to Generations in the World of Work. That's one that I'm working on now. The Gen Z Around the World will be out on January 15th, and that's through Emerald Publishing.
Oh, got it. Okay. And not only do we get to talk to Dr. Seemiller, but she has been featured on NPR, the New York Times, Time Magazine, Newsweek, and several other news publications and academic journals. She's been interviewed for other podcasts, radio shows, and other kinds of media. She's done market research for Fortune 10, 50, and 500 companies. She also has a TED Talk on Generation Z at TEDx Dayton, which showcased how Generation Z is making a difference in the world and has been watched by more than 250,000 viewers. So your name has been spread out there in all these different channels and medias. And I love that you're sharing the message about Generation Z and just generational research and what difference that they can make, especially from a sociological perspective. So tell us a little bit more. You can see, Corey, that we have people from all over and lots of things that are going on, normal, getting ready for the weekend type of things. And I love that people are connecting, having lunch with friends and doing things like that. So we're very glad to have all of you here today. And we're going to talk a little about this research that you've been doing and what things that you learned. But tell us about your background and how did you become a researcher on generations? How did that come about?
Well, it's really interesting because when I remember many years ago, I went to a professional development session when I was working at a different institution, and it was all about learning, all about millennials. And I sat there in the audience, with my arms crossed, and I was like, this guy is just full of nonsense. Like, what is all of this stuff? Generational research just categorizes people into boxes and it's stereotyping. I mean, I was not holding back in my thoughts. And then I had the audacity to go up to him after the session, and I kindly and gently sort of critiqued the idea of generational research. I can't to this day remember this man's name, or I would have sent him an apology letter and a gift basket. But at this point in time, I was like very adamant that this was, a lot of like boxing people in. It wasn't until many years later that I understood that generational research is just another form of demography, right? We study women, or we study people who live in, Georgia or whatever. We do this with other groups, and it seems to be incredibly acceptable, useful, and even informative in the way that we do our work. But when we do it with generations, everybody, the hair stands up. It's like, why are you boxing these people in? But I came to understand that generational research was more about understanding the trends of groups of people based on when they were born, because they're coming of age at a certain time in history in which things are different than other people when they came of age. And so that really does have a formative effect on people, on their values and motivations, and the way that they navigate the world. And so there is a lot of truth to that. And while there's diversity within generations, there's actually a lot of homogeneity, which I'll talk about later when we came up with, the findings of our study. But really how I ended up getting into it was I was working at my former institution, and I was recruiting for a leadership program that we had. That was a 4-year program. So we had to recruit students at our summer orientation events. So there were about nearly 20 events in the summer, and I would go down and staff a table and answer questions for students and have an info session. I'd been doing this since 2002. So I'd done my fair share of orientations by the time 2013 rolled around. And that year, there was something very different about the students that I was talking to. The questions I was getting asked, they were things that were much less around, is this good for my resume? What kind of skills will I develop? Will I make friends? To things like, will this help me develop my passion? Will I find community to be able to make a difference? It really just fascinatingly different. I left orientation that summer after, several of these, and said something is up. So I started looking online and was like, what is going on with this cohort of students in 2013? And I came across a generational birth chart, and it had this generation I'd never heard of called Generation Z. And I was like, oh, I thought everybody was just always going to be a millennial from now on. But it blew me away. And I was like, I don't know. I'm kind of skeptical about this generational stuff. I don't know. But then I started reading a little bit about Generation Z, and there wasn't much to know about them because they were still kids, a lot of them. And according to the birth chart from Sparks and Honey, which is a market research firm studying generations, the birth years were 1995 through 2010. Well, in the summer of 2013, that would have made the group either 17, 18 years old, traditional college going students. So I was like, well, I'm going to look this up and just see if there's maybe any similarities. And there were a lot of similarities about what I was looking at with research that had been done, particularly on high school students. And so I was like, wow, maybe this is important to know. So that really launched my interest and discovery into trying to figure out more about what is generational research, how do you do it, kind of the sociological perspective of it. And then kind of third, how can it be useful to us, particularly in higher education, to be able to morph and change in ways that help our recruit, retain, and help our students succeed better than ever before, right? We can't keep doing the old. So that's really what got me launched into it. And again, if I maybe tracked it down, I would find this nice gentleman, send him, a gift basket or something, and let him know he was right, I was wrong. But thank you for getting me into the trajectory of generational research.
Into a direction that you had no idea even existed. So
Exactly.
as you looked at this and you started doing that research, how did life and world experiences shape those perspectives? They went through some different eras and times and things. So what did you find in that regard?
Well, it was funny. The first round of what I would call sort of pseudo research was right after I realized that there might be something to this generational stuff in 2013. I didn't conduct an original study. I just started looking at other people's studies, and I put together my handout, right? The handout that would tell us everything we needed to know about Gen Z. The word got across campus that I had this handout, and I was summoned to speak about all of these great findings, which were not mine. By the time summer 2014 rolled around a year later, my graduate student at the time, who's now Dr. Megan Grace, my co-collaborator, she and I decided to actually do a study. And we did a nationwide study just out of curiosity. We were not faculty members. We were not researchers. We were student affairs professionals who were curious about making the college student experience better. And so we put together this whole study and started to find out a little bit about how Gen Z learns, how they're motivated, how they communicate, all these kinds of things, at least trends, right? Not 100%, but trends. And that was really useful. And then we sort of backtracked once we knew those things and started to look at, all right, what kind of societal events really shape generations? And we came out, so our very first book, called Generation Z Goes to College, was just sort of a snapshot of who they are and how they navigate the world. But Generation Z, A Century in the Making, was probably one of my favorite books to write, because it was all about the history of kind of the world and how it has impacted everything that we've seen, right? When I say a century in the making, it was like this generation didn't just show up and start doing things. They did things because their parents did, and because their grandparents did, and because history had laid the path for them to act in certain ways that were relatively predictable. So at that point, we were able to create like a framework to say, all right, here's some major events that are impacting these young people. Like, I'll give you an example. They're often referred to as the recession babies. The oldest ones, born in 95, were just, tweens. And, when the recession hit, and the younger ones, like my daughter in 2009, wasn't born yet. However, she, had her, younger years during a kind of a post-recession, everybody's getting back onto their feet, where the idea out there, or this kind of essence or sentiment, was money should scare you because there's not enough of it. It could be taken away at any time, and be careful. So now we're all shocked that we have these like 20-something young people that are really, really concerned about money, or making decisions about college that are including perhaps not taking out huge student loans, or we created this environment, like not purposefully, but this environment was created and basically fostered a mentality among a group of young people that grew up during a time in which they were told, be afraid that there's not enough money. And we've had swaths of people already that don't have enough money. But the overall sentiment in society was, even for people who came from families that were middle class, was there's not enough, be scared. And so I think that that's really interesting. And I don't think anybody put that message forth purposefully, but being conservative on our spending, or making a comment like, mom lost her job because of the recession, we've got to cut back, things like that. I mean, I even remember when my daughter was really little, and, we were, not too long outside of the recession, but I was living in California, and she picked up a thing of strawberries, a little plastic thing of strawberries. They were $8.99. I was like, oh, honey, we're not going to eat fresh fruit until we get back to Arizona. It is just too expensive. And I was, kind of joking about it. But then like 3 years later, she told somebody, she goes, we don't eat fresh fruit in California because it's just, we can't afford it. And I thought, here's my little kid, and granted, it was expensive. And there are a lot of people who can't afford $8.99 strawberries. And we were some of those people. But she carried that with her, right? And so these are the kinds of messages around the events that happen. So it's not just the event, it's the messaging around the event that makes it so profound, that sticks in the psyche of people, as they're coming of age.
I think that research and that having that understanding of the historical perspective and how those foundations is laid is really important too. I think in general, right now, I was listening to a story, a research recently. It's like this whole time that we're in is not unique. It's not the first time our country has gone through these kinds of um, sentiments and conflict and things like that. And so looking at historical perspective and seeing where it brings us and where it brings our children is really key. So how is diversity defined by Gen Z students? Because it is important to them.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, let me frame it with the idea of kind of how do a lot of older generations define diversity, right? In some ways, diversity is something that you count, right? The numbers of people or representation, which is an element of diversity. Diversity is this idea that's sort of proxy for inclusion or welcoming. So that's also important in terms of diversity. But for older folks, diversity is always something that we've done something with. We hire for, we manage it, we program for it, right? We do something with diversity. For Gen Zers, a lot of them, really are kind of the mindset that diversity is just who we are. Like the only reason that older generations had to do something with it in some sense was to create a more open, welcoming, inclusive, non-discriminatory, non-oppressive society, which is really important. But this generation says kind of aspirational diversity is this idea that we just honor people for who they are and how they show up, and that we're really lucky to have the various perspectives and experiences, and whoever and however people want to identify is up to them, and it's great. Just bring your whole self, and that many of them believe that authenticity and who you are will bring people's best selves out. So if you're an employer and you want to have the best employees you can have, then encourage them to be their authentic selves. And that's really where Gen Z lies with that, right? This idea. But they also know that they're situated in a world in which there are a lot of people, including people their age, but also a lot of older people who aren't open and supportive and welcoming. And this, one of the things that we found a couple times in different studies that we've done, is that Generation Z, we asked them, what is your biggest social concern, right? We've asked this in two different surveys, one in 2014 and one in 2021. And I was amazed as to how many responses we got were not tied to a particular social issue. That I thought, like, we got a lot for the environment, we got a lot for racism, sexism, social justice oriented ones, right? So we do know that that's important, both of those, environmental and social justice. But what we had that was fascinating was, my biggest social concern is that we are moving backwards in society, that we are taking rights away from people who had previously had them. We're making the world more difficult to navigate in as your authentic self. And that's my paraphrasing, but we had hundreds and hundreds of open-ended responses that basically said, why are we moving backwards and making life harder for people to be welcome, to be included in society? So their definition of diversity is so much broader and so much more, the definition itself is more inclusive than what we're used to dealing with. And so I see, as young people get into workplaces, they're challenging not just policies, but they're challenging the culture on, what does diversity look like? And how can I show up? And is this a safe place for me? And is it a safe place for other people who maybe it's not an identity that I have, but my friends, my colleagues who identify certain ways, is this safe for them too? So it's a fascinating look at how they really do see diversity.
Yeah, it's something they live and breathe, and are much more accepting. And that aspect of authenticity is a factor that really hadn't been emphasized before this generation, I don't think. So Jacqueline asked about Generation Z, and I identify this too, because excuse me, my dad was of that generation of, and she talks about how, you have a cheap dad who lived through the deep scarcity of World War II and post-World War II England. How is that lack of financial resources different from what Generation Z is? Or is there?
It's actually not much different. In Generation Z, a century in the making, and granted, this was focused on the US, given the data that we had, was, there's a lot more similarities between Gen Z and the GI generation than people would have expected. Certainly the GI generation was, came of age during a time of scarcity that looked very different than the scarcity of the, mid 2000s. But at the same time, there's still that outcome or output of creating an idea of the scarcity mentality, right? Or the fear that there's not enough money, or a competitive, someone's going to steal my job, right? Think about even these perceptions of, immigrant workers, right? Like there's not enough jobs to go around. We see a lot of things around legislation coming up that are very similar, that address that fear of someone's going to take my job. And so there are a lot of conditions that were similar, even though the context was very timely different. It was 80 years apart. But there are similarities, and what they do result in is some thinking that is quite similar to each other. So you'll find that Gen Zers might do or say things that look like those from the GI generation. It's kind of hard now to juxtapose them next to each other, since there's few left in the GI generation at this point in time, and certainly not like in the workforce. But there is a lot of similarity, and what we're finding is that there is a lot of similarity also between generations, just in general, right? Because we do have some cyclical things, as you were talking about, right? Like this, sometimes we're not in a unique time in history. When we experienced this last time, how did we feel about this? So when we look at something like, yes, Gen Z is the only one born into a world where social media existed. We didn't have that before. But then you think about it like, okay, well, what about the GI generation and the silent generation when the automobile became commercialized, right? It had the same types of impacts while the situation might have been a little bit different. And so that's from, kind of sociologically, we have to see what are the impacts of that, right? And how does that influence behavior versus the actual incident or situation itself?
That makes sense. That makes total sense. The other aspect of this is that it's not just dependent on the country that the generation is from. So tell us about your research that broadened that perspective and looked at it from a global perspective, those 91 researchers in 81 countries. So tell us how that came about and what that looks like.
Yeah, well, that's a really funny story. So I'm on LinkedIn, so feel free, follow me, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm there quite often. But I get a lot of messages from people just saying, hey, I'm really interested in your research, or I'm, whatever it might be. Like I read this article, or just even asking me a question. And I had a doctoral student from Spain, and she had messaged me and said, oh, I'm doing a study, I'm thinking about doing a study on Gen Z. Can I talk to you? And normally I get so many of these requests that I can't take them all. But for whatever reason that day, I was feeling like, yeah, I'm going to squeeze her in. So I did. And I had this Zoom meeting with her, and she had a couple advisors with her. And we ended up talking, and we said, you know what, you're right in time, because we're about to launch a replication of our 2014 study. We're about to do that again in the US in 2021. So she had contacted me in March of 21, and we were going to launch in fall of 21, kind of smack in the middle of COVID, kind of get some COVID data. And she said, can I replicate it, but translate it in Spanish and offer it in Spain? And I said, we were like, okay. So we ended up going through our IRB at our institution and had to find out all of these restrictions and so forth. But we did it, and we're like, they're like, you have to sign them on as official collaborators. So that's why we ended up, when I say we had 91 collaborators, we literally had people signing documents. Wow. So within like maybe even less than a week, I got an email from a professor in Australia and said, I love your research. Is there any way you want to partner on something? Are you going to be doing a study anytime soon? Can we jump on and maybe survey our students in Australia? And I was like, okay, yeah. So US, Spain, and Australia, that sounds like a really cool study. And so we had done a couple studies with a research team in Brazil before. So I was like, well, why don't we loop Brazil in? Like, let's just get a bunch of continents here. So we got them involved. And next thing you know, we're like, this could be a really cool study. Because then the people in Australia are like, what about our friends in Bulgaria? I'm like, I don't know anything about Bulgaria. Awesome. Then they jumped on. Next thing you know, we had all of these people asking other people to do this. And so we decided to broaden it. So we went through like Google Scholar and ResearchGate to find anybody who had cited us, because then they would know of our work from other countries. And we reached out to every single person, cold emails. Hey, listen, this is what we're trying to do. We got more than 30 countries signed on, and then each country had a team. That's why we had 91 signed on, and we ended up creating, we had the survey already. We translated it, well, they translated it into their languages, and we populated it in the survey, but we offered it in 19 different languages. Wow. And by the viral snowball effect, it ended up in the hands of 81 people from 81 countries, more than 30,000 Gen Zers. And so we were so excited about this. This was such a great study. And we had pitched the idea. We'd written a book proposal and pitched an idea to Emerald to write a book about the differences between Gen Z around the world. And we got the data back and realized that they're not really that different from country to country. And we had to backpedal a little bit, right? And we're like, oh, so we ended up changing the sub name a little bit. So it's like understanding the global cohort, because they ended up being like, there were nuances, right? I don't want to discount that, but they weren't nearly as significant as we thought. And there were so many things that were straight up the same. Like, I'll give you this example that was fascinating. In 2014, when we asked the participants to look at 32 different characteristics, personal characteristics, and mark whether something doesn't describe me, somewhat describes me, or greatly describes me, the characteristic that came up with the highest percentage of greatly describes me was loyal. So that was in the US study in 2014. We asked the same exact question in the global study. In the US group, loyal, still number one. When we looked at it around the world, like almost every single country had loyal as number one. And now the country that didn't was Singapore, and it had it as number two. I mean, we're talking out of 32 characteristics, and loyal was not the first one at the top of the list. It was smack in the middle. So it wasn't like a survey bias.
Right.
Are they loyal? I have absolutely no idea. But these young people think that they are very loyal, and around the world, they think they're very loyal. So, so it's just one of those kind of things where it was like, wow, there's a lot of similarity. And so we looked at everything from social media use to social concerns. I mean, just amazing how similar we found the data to be.
So sounds like your research then with this collaboration of everybody just being very interested in this research, it covered South America, Europe, Asia. What other countries were represented?
Africa, Australia. We had every continent but Antarctica.
Oh,
yeah.
Interesting.
And I don't know if they have a university in Antarctica that we could reach out to. So until they build that, we so we had
maybe somebody in our audience knows.
Yeah, the cruise ship or whatever that sits outside of Antarctica. But yeah, I mean, we definitely had an overrepresentation of Europe. That was for sure. Just simply, there's just a lot of countries there. And there were a lot of collaborators that already knew each other. So we did a kind of a research snowball effect. So again, people, there are limitations to the study. We're very forthcoming with those. I mean, we're not writing pop media, we're writing academic research. And so we want to be very clear about where those pitfalls are, but we do have a lot of strengths in what we did, where we had a lot of inter-rater reliability, because we had so many people looking at the same data over and over. And when we wrote the book, it was neat. What we did is we had our collaborators were from various institutions, but they were from a swath of disciplines, everybody from nutrition sciences to engineering. And what we did is we wrote chapters of the book that were like, communication or interpersonal relationships, money, and people in their own fields were able to write those chapters. So what we did is we had chapter teams of all of the researchers who wanted to participate. So we had about 25 maybe authors, and people jumped on different teams, and then they looked at the global data, not just because they all received their country's specific data, but then they got the global data, and all the chapters are written for a global audience, which is really neat. And then we were able to break it up by world region. So if anybody's familiar, it's called the World Values Study. And the World Values Study breaks basically most countries that are participating in this are segmented into regions of the world based on values, not based on geographic location. So for instance, the United States is aligned with like the UK and Australia because we're English speaking. industrialized, so they're partnered like that. So we actually were able to look at the data by these values, these world region values, which were super cool too, to see if there was any nuance between those types of values already. So really neat data. Loved working with all of our collaborators. I got to travel to Europe twice to meet with different collaborators and present, and we presented at a national conference, and so a lot of fun, really great.
And this is the book that's coming out in January then, right?
Yep, it's called Gen Z Around the World. Yep.
So what are some of the other values? You mentioned loyalty as, or being loyal as the number one. What were some of the other ones that you found surprising, or that the students, the youth marked?
Yeah. Well, it was funny. It wasn't actually surprising. They were, I believe, the same exact 5 from the 2014 study from the US. They were just in a different order. But they were responsibility, like open-mindedness, and some of those kinds of things, which again, like I said, weren't incredibly surprising. Now, the question that we asked was, how does this describe you? Now, if we were to ask people, which we did on a subsequent study, how would you describe other people? We get different answers, right? It was funny. We actually asked. We took all of those 32, and we asked in a study called Generations in the World of Work. Now, this was only in the US, but these were across generations, and we just did this in April. We asked them, basically to indicate which generations you think are basically the most of whatever this is, the most collaborative, the most visionary, the most whatever. Well, wouldn't you know that every generation put their own as the best, right? Like my generation is the most collaborative, mine is the most responsible. So once we kind of toss that data out, we're like, okay, obviously, what was the second one? And interestingly, for a number of indicators, we found that a lot of people generally think that Gen X has some of the highest rated kind of characteristics around things like I said, collaboration, responsibility, determination, follow through. So it was really kind of an interesting thing as we see what are other people's perceptions.
Well, and that's why it's so important not just to assume, but to actually ask and conduct the research. So,
well, and I'll add to that too, is it's also dependent on what your perspective is or perception is of something. So for instance, Gen Z may say that they're very loyal, but millennials, Gen Xers, and baby boomers in the workplace might say absolutely not. They keep quitting their jobs and leaving. Well, it might be that Gen Zers are loyal to their families, and they know that they can't live off that income, and they have to go find some other income source that's higher to be able to support their families. Maybe they're loyal to the profession, and they go on and work in something that calls them, that has a greater impact. Maybe, so loyalty, it's interesting. Our own definitions of these things might vary. And so as we say, oh yeah, well, they're not this or they're not that, it might be skewed with other things. Like I've heard so many people say Gen Z is just apathetic. Well, yeah, you know what? There's apathetic people in every generation. Like every generation we have duds, people that are just, not rising to their potential or making bad choices. And there's others that have these superstars. It's not unique to one generation. But what's interesting is when I hear Gen Z is apathetic, I ask them, okay, well, you're making a determination about their motivation. What is it that you're seeing that makes you believe that? And they say, they're not working overtime. They're not coming to work early. You should be the first one to work and the last one to leave. And I said, that's just a horrible, bad habit that we were all taught, so to get overworked and underpaid. And the fact that they are actually not willing to be abused does not make them apathetic. And so once you start picking apart things, you can see that there's a lot of nuance to it that does, in fact, debunk stereotypes, right? That in some ways you're like, okay, what does apathy even look like? And some are apathetic, some don't want to work, right? Just like I said, people across every generation. But we have to look at things a little bit deeper and have that appreciation to say, okay, rather than just writing them off, we can say, hey, why is this happening? And is there something that we're in control over that's structural or programmatically that we're doing that is making any group of people or any one person not be able to rise to the potential that they have?
Right. Well, and I think that's key, is that you have that, not just ask the question, but do it in a context and dig a little deeper in terms of, well, what do you mean by loyalty, or what do you mean by what, different values that you might have. And, we all heard about silent quitting during COVID and that kind of thing. And that's not just a Gen Z phenomena, but probably they would understand or relate to it very well. So what about for Gen Z, the impact? We talked about COVID and what's the impact? What's the post-COVID perspective now? How did that make an impact on Gen Z, or it's pretty global experience, for everyone. So what did your research find, or what did you observe with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there kind of have two really kind of different trains of thought with this. We did our survey in 2014 and we did one in 2021, and just comparing the US data just to kind of stay consistent, we saw very, very little change in the measures. There were only a couple indicators that were kind of obvious in terms of differences. And the biggest one that we noted was actually preferences for learning. Prior to the pandemic, preferences for learning were very much intrapersonal. I want to learn on my own. I don't like working in groups. I don't want to do, like interpersonal connections with people. After, or like we'd say mid-COVID in 2021, that was different. Interpersonal learning rated very low compared to interpersonal learning, which was learning with others, and social learning, which is learning around others, even if you're learning independently, like you're sitting in a lab and you're doing your own thing, but you're around other people. Those measures went very high. And that's, while we don't have a causation for that, it seems to be obvious that an oversaturation of intrapersonal learning probably drove these young people to say, enough's enough. I really want to be around people. So that was something that changed. A lot of their social concerns stayed very much kind of the same. We did see, again, people concerned about the environment, social justice issues. It was interesting because we actually had, one of our partners was Russia, and this was pre-Ukraine, or right around that time. But the concern is that those students would kind of skew the data around their concerns around war because they were in war. So we had to look at those kinds of things for other countries as to what might have been happening situationally. But when we look specifically at the US data, we did see a lot of consistency. We asked a number of questions that were new, though, in the 2021 survey, one of which was around COVID. Did it impact your major selection or your ability to get a job and those kind of things? And of course, we saw percentages that said yes, it did, which wasn't surprising. But when we talked about what's your biggest social concern, and we had an open-ended question, very, very, very few people wrote COVID as a concern. They were still going back to their central concerns, right, around social and climate and economic justice, which were the three areas that they just continue to resonate with, and globally tend to resonate with. And so I think those are, kind of important to point out. And so other things that we also asked that we didn't ask the first time is we asked about money. Now, we said, if you had $100 left over after you had paid all of your living expenses, what would you do with it? And we gave them some categories. Now, the largest percent, like the vast majority of that money, would go into savings. So we saw, while we didn't ask that question before, it substantiated what we already knew from the earlier studies, as they were, had a lot of concerns around their own personal finances. They're recession babies. We knew that they had a fear of money, debt averse. And then we come into this and we ask this question. And so even if it wasn't the same exact question, we did find a lot of the similar kind of similarities as we went. So yeah, that to me was also interesting, because I wondered to what extent we were going to see some differences. Now, my second kind of take on this, which is from a totally different angle, is that COVID, during 2020, 2021, maybe part of 2022, we did see some shifts in the way that we exist, we do business, we live. I find it quite interesting, though, that there was a complete rush as a society, at least in the United States, to get back as fast as we could to 2019, as if COVID never happened. So in some sense, there was the ability to be armed with new skills, new tools, and new ways of doing things. where Gen Z could adapt, right, and take advantage of that moment. Well, everybody could, but I'm thinking Gen Z. And then to go back to what you were doing, you're going to get some of the same responses that you got before, because if we're doing things the same way, right? Like if you're going back to the office, you're doing, you know what I mean? You're in person for things. You're literally setting up the same circumstances as when we first collected data, as if COVID in some ways never happened. And that to me is also an interesting element that I think, to consider.
It does. And it is interesting because in some areas, those changes have been adapted and implemented. I know in our profession as college advisors, now many more people are doing things just virtually. People, especially international, were doing virtually, but now myself included, we just kind of adopted that and embraced it. So it's interesting to see that perspective. So Carmen, it looks like you have a question.
Sure. Can you repeat what the three biggest social concerns were?
Yeah, they are. They're social justice. Those were the categories that most got the concerns kind of clustered in. So racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, things around xenophobia, around immigration, stuff like that. So that was social justice. Then sort of situated sort of next to each other would be economic justice. So things around both personal finances, I'm not going to have enough money. And then also secondarily, like society is not going to have enough money, right? Like this idea of poverty, access to housing, cost of higher education, access to healthcare, those kinds of things that fit in economic justice. And then the third, as I mentioned, was environmental justice. And for this is a really important designation, is that environmental justice doesn't just include climate change. It includes things like lack of biodiversity, healthy and safe drinking water, and reduction of factory farming, preservation and conservation of natural resources. So it's beyond just like this kind of idea of climate change or global warming. It's a lot more to it, but that would be what we would call environmental justice.
Well, it sounds like things are much more expansive, that they're not real specific, that they have a lot broader application.
Yeah, well, and this generation also has a broader idea of these things. I mean, given their access to technology and social media, they're much more well-versed than any of us could have been at their age, just simply by not having access to anything other than maybe your local newspaper or your 5 o'clock news, is they can get information. It's a whole other idea about the accuracy of the information, right, and the bias of it, but they actually at least have the ability to gather information and have a much larger repertoire of understanding of the world than I know I did when I was their age.
Definitely. You mentioned social media. What particular things about social media did you find?
Again, we found a lot of similarities between our 2014 and 2021 study, with the exception that TikTok had come about between that period. So that wasn't something we originally asked about. But we found the same kinds of things, is that they're really drawn to media in which the primary function is video or photo based posts, right? Like while you can get on Facebook and post a picture, that's not the primary kind of modality. So they were jumping on things like Snapchat, Instagram, TikTok now, and then they're on, places like YouTube when they're doing their own videos as influencers, because many of them, think they're influencers, or they're posting things to be helpful. Or they're getting information from YouTube and TikTok, which interestingly, when we asked them, where do you go to learn information? We asked them in 2014 and 2021, and the number one is I go to Google, I go to YouTube, whereas the rest of us go to Google. So they're jumping on, these video-based platforms. So that hasn't changed. They do like using kind of imagery as a way to communicate. We'll see. It was really hard to tell with TikTok. I mean, it hasn't moved up in terms of its prominence among the other platforms to the point where it's like number one yet. But if we were to do the study in 5 years, we may find that, or who knows, since then Threads has come about, Twitter's changed to X. So there's a lot of movement in the social media industry. So it's a little hard to track like specific platforms, but what you can do is you can see what kind of modalities are they attracted to, and that's likely where you're going to find them. Internationally, where we, outside of the US, WhatsApp is very, very popular, particularly because people have a lot of international connections, and that's a free way of being able to communicate via phone, video, or messaging across national borders that we don't do as much in the US. So again, watching these, keeping our eye out for them is really, going to be important.
Yeah, yeah, I agree, definitely. So as college advisors or parents, as we're working with these teens, what can we do to effectively communicate with them and support them as they, especially, as they're looking at higher education? So what are some things that you have observed or recommend?
Well, I think there's kind of two lanes for this. One is, what can we do to support them interpersonally, right? College decision making is a huge choice. It's very expensive. They, like I said, they're debt averse, they're risk averse more so than other generations. And if they're not entirely for certain what they want to do, some of them may not want to go to college and take out a loan to be in a major that they're not sure that they want to be in. And so, making that decision is really important. And I know that a lot of us say, oh, the expectation is go to college because that's your pathway or your gateway to economic success. And it has been in many regards and in many studies for decades. And we do know that. But also supporting them to be able to make decisions about other pathways that might be important to them, right? Where we look at vocational technical education, we look at apprenticeships, we look at getting them into the workforce, and then using tuition remission programs to go back to school when they feel like they're ready and they know what they want to study. So interpersonally, that's huge. Also understanding that this generation has more diagnosed mental health issues than any previous generation. Now, that may just be a reporting issue, right? Also, we may have always had a lot of mental health issues, but the reality is that this is a generation that is, has these diagnosed issues and is relatively on the forefront of sharing that with people. Like, listen, I have ADHD. How are you going to accommodate me in my classroom? And so being able to be aware that also these high levels, particularly of anxiety and depression among this generation, are weighing down on them, and making these college decisions might weigh much more heavily on them. They may want to be choosing things like living closer to home because of relationships with parents, or the fear of meeting new people or making new friends. Some things that may have been less of a consideration perhaps for other people or the parents when they were making those choices, is really kind of understanding that the college choice is much more than academic. So that's the interpersonal piece. I think, when we talk about supporting them in the structural piece, is how do we prepare them with the skills to be able to be successful in applying and then being in higher education. It's more than just teaching them how to do laundry. It's how to talk to a teacher if you have a question, right? So you're in high school and you're talking to them about, okay, if you don't understand your homework, you need to go talk to your teacher. Empowering them with the skills to be able to do that, to hold group members accountable on group projects, to be able to approach and introduce themselves to people that they don't know. Some of these real competency skills that are essential for them to be successful. Time management, follow through, social and emotional learning. How are we providing them support? I think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And, if we were to overlay that on a higher education institution, and then we look at the very bottom rung, we're not doing much in that rung, which is really their everyday safety and security. Because, in some campuses have moved towards this direction with, doing things like food pantries and, working with homeless students and so forth. But there's other elements of safety and security, which is emotional and psychological safety. And so, I talk to a lot of college administrators who say, we don't have enough money to staff counselors. And I'm like, that's just a priority thing. Because I understand something, and I'm, again, not advocating for certain departments to close, but like, they're not going to go to tutoring if they can't even emotionally, have the capacity to be successful in getting motivated to even walk on campus at all. Like, we have got to be getting, helping support mental health. That has to be one of the biggest priorities. That has to be on that rung with food, right? It's food and housing and psychological and mental support. And if we shift our thinking like that, even with, parents too, we can be much more supportive in understanding how a student is grappling with both the technical and the interpersonal skills that they need to be able to navigate into college.
We can serve them so much better by giving them that opportunity to teaching those skills and exercising those skills, especially before they go to college. And we have more and more academic coaches and people trying to help students once they get to college. But that's been one of my messages in my UCLA class and just in general is we're here to help students with the full transition and be truly ready for college. We've often focused on that for students who are neurodivergent, but we need to do it for everybody. And I see there's a great need for that. So that makes total sense. So what other research, what new things are you working on, Corey?
Well, our book comes out January 15th, as I mentioned before, and we are knee deep into another book called A Guide to Generations in the World of Work. This will be our first publication that looks across generations, which is, kind of interesting take. And so that one is due out in 2025 through SAGE. And so really what we're doing right now is analyzing all that data and trying to figure out the nuances of different generations in the workplace. But I do think what's really informative about that is not only is that information good for supervisors, managers, organizations, and so forth, it's good for higher education administrators because we are preparing students to go into this workplace. And so being able to understand that if we have students that for instance, communicate in one way, but they're going into a workforce where pretty much most of their colleagues and supervisors are going to communicate in another way. It's important for us in the college setting to be able to prepare them to go into those spaces. We do a lot of work, and I worked in career services and I've done career development for a long time, as we do a lot of kind of technical preparation. Are you ready? Do you know the knowledge you need to be successful in this profession? Do you have the networks you need? Have you met people? But really, what is it about some of those kind of interpersonal dynamics that you're going to need to know? Can you shift your ability to communicate depending on who you're talking to? If you're talking to your baby boomer boss, you're in a work setting, do you just go up face to face and just chat with them? Whereas maybe with a millennial, you might actually text with them, right? And so being able to shift, right, across generational preferences is a really important skill that I think our college students need to know how to do in order to be successful in their workplaces.
Well, that's important too from a diversity perspective, and they're much more international. There are more international opportunities for this generation than any other, I believe, too. So they need to be able to shift not only from that perspective of generation, but a generation in another country, another language, another culture, and that's key as well. So I think, yeah. So that's exciting. So we get to look forward to that coming out in 2025.
Exactly. Another book. So yeah, that'll be fun. So that's pretty much going to occupy most of my time between now and then. Been doing a little bit of market research stuff. That's a lot of fun. Companies that don't tell me who they are, but they want to know if young people will buy jeans. And I'm like, a jeans company. So I'm out there helping the world continue on. Doing some interviews. I really try to get myself out on as many podcasts and interviews like this, just because I think it's important for us all to just be more aware. And so that's where a lot of my effort goes, is into just kind of getting the word out so that we can all work better together. I mean, that's the whole thing, is if we can get each other to rise to our potential and work more successfully, we all benefit from that. So I think the work I do makes me feel like it's a calling rather than, just a research.
Well, you echo the same feeling that many of us have in terms of what we do, and it is very fulfilling working with a younger generation. It challenges us, it enlivens us, it helps us all feel much younger, and it gives us hope. It gives us hope for the future too. So thank you for the work that you do and the research. And boy, my audience is here. We're available anytime that you need. And we're very glad to be part of that and contribute to spreading that word and making sure people know and understand. So thank you.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's always fun to talk about this. It's always fun to talk with you too. We always have great conversations.
Well, thank you. Well, hopefully someday we'll get to meet in person, right? This ends our webinar for today, and we'll see you again on January 5th.